Hey there friends, in this video I'm going to show you how to create this Peace on Earth card featuring Stampin' Up's In the Pines bundle and the Peace and Joy bundle. Now this card features working with felt and embossing paste through a stencil. So the first thing that I'm going to do for this card is I'm going to create my felt piece that I'm going to be using in this circular area. So this felt piece, it's a piece of Just Jade felt, and it comes in Stampin' Up's Festive Felt Sheet Combo Pack. So there's 4 different colors of felt sheets. There's this Just Jade, Real Red, there's a brown, and there's a white. Now what I want to do is I want to add some embossing paste, and I want to run it through this polka dot stencil you see here. Now you do want to make sure that the embossing paste is going to be, that the area you're going to cover with the embossing paste is going to be big enough that you'll be able to die cut a circle out of it. So the circle dies that I'm going to be using are the stitch circle dies, and I'm going to be die cutting actually 2 circular pieces. One, a circle, this is the second from the largest die, and then I'm going to be die cutting basically a ring around this die cut circle because I'm going to be using this for 2 different cards. So I'm going to take my polka dot stencil and I want to place it over top of my felt piece. Now I'm overlapping it with where the embossing paste continued from the first time I did this for my actual original cards. So now what I want to do is I want to continue on, and I'm going to emboss about the same area. Now I'm going to keep my die out just so I can get a general sense of how big of an area I'm going to need to add my embossing paste to. So I'm using my shimmery white embossing paste. I'm going to be using a palette knife to apply it. So I'm just dipping my palette knife into my container, and then I'm holding my stencil in place, and I'm, as you can see, running the embossing paste through my stencil. Now I'm going slowly and carefully because I'm trying not to extend beyond the edge of my stencil. And I'm trying to extend my embossing paste all the way pretty much to the edge of my felt piece, just so that I can make the most of my felt piece. I'm going to be die cutting close to the edge. So now I'm just going to take a look. It looks like it should be big enough, but I'm going to add just a little bit more over here along this side. And I want to make sure that all the holes of the stencil are filled with my embossing paste. So that should be a big enough area now. So I'm basically just going to smooth it out. And now I'm just going to carefully lift my stencil so you can see how that looks. So a couple things when you're working with embossing paste. First of all, you're going to want to make sure your container's closed right away. Then you're going to want to take a baby wipe, and you're going to want to clean your palette knife immediately. If you let this dry on your palette knife, it stays on there. It's almost impossible to get off, and then you won't get a nice smooth spread next time you go to use it. The other thing you're going to have to do is to clean this right away. So I just like to put this onto a piece of grid paper and run a baby wipe over it to get off as much as I can, and then afterwards I'll run it under the tap. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to let this piece dry completely. It's probably going to take at least a half an hour, maybe more. So I'm going to let it dry, and then I'll be back once this is dry. So now the embossing paste on my felt is now dry. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to die cut it with my circle die. I'm using the Stitch Shapes dies, and I'm using the second from the largest circle. So I'm going to center that over top of my embossed area. And I just want to make sure, because I'm going to be using the same piece for 2 cards, I want to make sure that when I position the circle, I'm going to have enough room to place the other die around the outline of it. And that looks like a good placement. So I'm just going to remove this die, and I'm going to hold my die in place with a little piece of tape. Now I'm going to take this and I'm going to run it through my die cutting machine. Now because the felt is fairly thick and now I also have embossing paste on it, it's going to take quite a number of passes back and forth through the die cutting machine in order to cut through this. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then when I come back I'll let you know how many times I had to go through the machine. I'm back from my die cutting machine. And as you can see, I placed a little bit of wax paper over top of the felt, and that was to apply some extra pressure as I was running this through my die cutting machine. Now I went back and forth about 6 times without the wax paper, but I found that it just wasn't cutting all the way through. So then I came back and put the wax paper on top to apply a little bit of extra pressure. But here you can see, even with all that back and forth, it's still not perfectly die cut out. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to take my paper snips and I'm just going to gently follow along the line, because as you can see, it's pretty much mostly die cut, but just where it didn't go all the way through, I'm just following along and cutting it out with my scissors. So there you can see how that piece looks. So we're now going to move on and we're going to continue to create the additional die cut pieces that we're going to need for the card. So you can see the card here, and I'm now going to be using my pine woods dies that you see here, and I'm going to be die cutting one tree out of mint macaron cardstock and one out of shaded spruce cardstock. So if you look at the dies, you can see I have 2 of these kind of solid tree dies. So these are the ones I'm going to be using. The larger one I'm going to die cut out of shaded spruce, and then the smaller one I'm going to be die cutting out of the mint macaron. And now I'm just using a little bit of my Scotch removable tape to hold them in place so they don't shift as I'm die cutting. So I will be die cutting these. Now as you can see, I also have here this die cut piece greeting. So for that, I'm going to be using another set of dies. These are the Joy dies, and I need the word piece, so the inner area that you see die cut in gold, and then the outer area, which I'm going to be die cutting out of white. So here I have a scrap piece of brushed gold metallic cardstock, and I've already put some double-sided adhesive on the back of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to position my die onto this piece of cardstock here. I'm going to hold it in place, and I'm going to be die cutting that as well when I go to my die cutting machine. And then finally, I'm going to look here for, see if I have a big enough scrap piece, which it doesn't look like I do. So I'm just going to die cut this out of a cardstock panel. So I have here Whisper White cardstock. So I'm going to be die cutting this portion of my sentiment out of white. So once I've gone ahead and die cut all of these pieces, I will be back. So I'm back from my die cutting machine, and you can see I've die cut all my pieces. So I'm going to set these aside for the time being. And I have here now a 4 by 5 1/4 inch piece of Just Jade cardstock. And then I also have some Just Jade and some Shaded Spruce Classic ink. Now I'm going to be using this large tree image from the In the Pines stamp set. And I'm going to be stamping it along the left-hand side of my cardstock piece. So first off, I want to position my circle here just so that I can get the sense of where I want to actually stamp my trees. So I'm going to start with the Just Jade cardstock, or sorry, Just Jade Classic ink. And this is going to be about the height that I'm going to want to stamp this tree. So I'm going to carefully move that circle and stamp. So there you can see I have my first image stamped. So now I'm just going to clean my stamp. And now I'm going to ink my stamp in my Shaded Spruce Classic ink. And I'm going to stamp this one so that it slightly overlaps the first and is slightly lower. So like so. And you can see what's interesting is in looking at the colors, the Just Jade and Shaded Spruce, you would actually think that Just Jade would be lighter. But when stamped, it actually turns out the Just Jade stamps darker than the Shaded Spruce. So I just thought I would point that out. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to close these ink pads so I don't accidentally lay anything on top of them. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my Subtle 3D embossing folder and I'm going to dry emboss this piece of cardstock, and I'm also going to dry emboss the peace greeting at the same time. So I'm going to put these inside my embossing folder and then I'm going to run this through my die cutting machine. So I'm back from my die cutting machine and you can see that I have that sentiment outline has been dry embossed, and now my cardstock panel has been dry embossed as well. Whenever you want to combine stamping and embossing, dry embossing like this, you always want to make sure you stamp your image first and you dry emboss it second. If you were to dry emboss or stamp after you did the embossing, you actually would end up with a patchy image. You wouldn't get that nice, clean, solid impression. So now I'm going to take my felt circle here and I'm going to be sticking it onto my panel. So now to stick this down, I'm going to be using some glue dots. So I'm just going to use my tweezers to carefully place glue dots on the back of my felt piece. And actually I may try, it might be a little bit easier to press it against and pull it off rather than trying to pick them off with my tweezers. So I've placed 6 glue dots at the back of this. You want to make sure that you do have a liberal amount of glue dots so that it really holds this piece in place. The other thing you could use, actually, not just glue dots, I had this out to use and then I completely forgot about this, but this double-sided adhesive, it's called tear and tape adhesive. That's actually probably the easiest way to secure this down. So you can use either one or you can use a combination. So I'm just going to remove the backing of the tear and tape adhesive. And then now I'm going to stick this circle down so that it is probably a little bit less than 1/8 of an inch away from either edge, from the left edge and the bottom edge, like so. Now I'm going to stick down one of my trees here. So now you can see here that when I stick it down on this felt piece, that because there's dimension to the felt piece, if we just stick the tree down, the tree's kind of going to be angled downwards. So what I'm going to want to do for this is I'm going to want to stick some glue dots on part of the tree, and then I'm going to place a little bit of dimensional foam underneath the top part of the tree. So I'm just going to use my tweezers here, and I'm going to place some glue dots at the back of the tree kind of in the center area. So I'm looking for sections that are big enough where I can hide the glue dots so that they're not going to show from the front of the die cut piece. Now for the dimensional foam, you can see that my pieces are, the actual Stampin' Dimensionals are relatively big, so I'm not going to be able to hide them at the back of this tree. So what I'm basically doing is I'm just cutting little pieces and sticking it to the back of the tree, but I have to make sure that I cut the pieces small enough that, again, you're not going to see them showing in the front of the tree. So I just need it. So once you've got the placement of your little bitty pieces of dimensional foam and you have your glue dots, you can now go ahead and stick the first tree down. So I want to stick this one so that the top of the tree is slightly offset from the top of the tree there. the stem is going to be aligned with the bottom of my circle like so, and it's going to overlap slightly on the right hand side. So now I'm going to do the same thing with my smaller tree. I'm going to place a few mini glue dots on the back. And you may have to either fold the mini glue dots or kind of squish them inwards a little bit to make sure they don't show through the front. And then once again, I'm going to cut a very thin piece of Stampin' Dimensional, and I'm going to place it behind the top portion of the tree and hope that I cut it small enough. So now this one, I want to position it a little bit lower, but I still want it, I want it to overhang the circle. So you can see I'm not aligning it with the very bottom because I do want it to stick up a little bit higher than the circle. So now I'm going to take this white ribbon. This is from the Flowers for Every Season ribbon combo pack. And I'm going to take a piece that is probably about 5.5 or 6 inches. And I'm going to cut it. And then I'm going to lay it across my card. And I'm going to fold the ends around to the back. So I'm positioning it so that it's about 1/4 inch up from the bottom edge of my panel. And I'm going to stick it down, but I'm not pressing my tape down super firmly. So I've taped the ends to the back. Now I have here a 12-inch piece of the same ribbon, and I'm going to feed it underneath my ribbon. I'm going to fold it in half, and then I'm going to tie a half knot. Now, as I pull it tight, you can see it's pulling my ribbon tight. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm actually going to have to loosen this ribbon. And that's why I said to you, don't pull it super tight because, or sorry, don't press the tape down a super amount, because when you pull it tight, it creates extra tension. And then once you've tied that knot, you can adjust the tension of the ribbon to just the right amount. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie this ribbon in a bow. And it may take a little bit of adjusting. You may have to do this a few times to get the bow in the direction, oriented in the direction that you want it to be, and to get it to the size you want it to be. I'm not the best bow tire, so this usually takes a little bit of fiddling for me before I get it to the shape and position that I want. Then, once you're happy with the size of your bow, you can go ahead and you can trim the ends on an angle. So now I don't want that shifting, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a mini glue dot and I'm going to lift up my ribbon. I'm going to place a glue dot underneath where the center area of the bow is. And I'm also going to place a mini glue dot under the ribbon, just kind of spaced apart in several areas. So just make sure that the ribbon stays flat against the cardstock. Like so. So now before continuing on, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to center and stick this onto my card front. And my note card is a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch note card, which I created out of Just Jade cardstock. So to stick my panel down, I want to add some dimension to it. So I'm going to be placing some Stampin' Dimensionals at the back, like so. So now I'm just going to go ahead, I'm going to remove the backing from my dimensionals, and then I'm going to center and stick this onto the front of my note card. So there you can see how that looks. So now let's go ahead and we're going to grab the word piece here. And as I mentioned to you, the piece, I die cut it. There was some self-adhesive backing. I think there was self-adhesive backing on the section that I die cut it. Yeah, there is. So now what I need to do is I just need to find the edge of the backing, and then I need to pull it off. And then I want to center this and stick it to the outline piece. So now as you see, we're going to be sticking it down and we're going to be overlapping it. But again, we're going to run into the same issue as we did with the trees. It's going to be on two different height surfaces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place some Stampin' Dimensionals on the back of sections of my greeting. And I'm going to be using a combination of actual dimensionals and pieces that I'm cutting from the edges of my dimensionals. So I've placed dimensional foam on the back of the C, E, and part of the A. Let's just see here. So I could probably put one in another section of the A here. And then for the E and the P, I'm going to be placing some mini glue dots. And it's probably a good idea to be fairly liberal with the glue dots because we are sticking it to the felt. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to remove the backing from my dimensional pieces. And now I can go ahead and position this on my card. So I'm going to position it so that it slightly overlaps the tree. And I want the bottom to slightly overlap the ribbon, like so. So now I'm going to be using from the stamp set that coordinates with the die that I used here. I want Peace on Earth, so I'm just going to grab my On Earth stamp from here. I'm going to place it on an acrylic block. And then using my Just Jade classic ink, I'm going to ink it up and I'm going to stamp it onto a scrap piece of Whisper White cardstock. Now you just want to make sure it's dry, and then we're going to take our scissors and you're going to, when you cut this out, you want to cut it out leaving just a very slight white border. So there you can see how that looks. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a strip of Stampin' Dimensional. Basically, I'm cutting it off the edge of my dimensional sheets. I'm going to remove the backing. And then now, I'm going to position it underneath the word Peace and stick it directly onto my ribbon. So that's the other reason you wanted the mini glue dot underneath the ribbon, so that the ribbon doesn't flop around as it's holding the weight of the greeting. So now the last thing I want to do is to add a few gems to my card, and I'm going to be using these gold gems. I'm going to place one Let's see, I don't know if I want that one there or not. Might place one there, and so there you can see I've added a few gems to it. So there you have it, friends. There you see what our card looks like, and it's now finished.